So recently at Pure Indian Foods, we decided to recreate what has become a quintessentially English sauce, a Worcestershire sauce, because believe it or not, it actually has an Indian origin, and we actually think that there's a little bit of a mystery to be solved with this sauce, and it all starts with this guy right here. This is Lord Marcus Hill, later to become the third Baron Sandys, and in 1835 he returned from Bengal, India, serving in the British Army. And he fell in love while he was in India, not with a woman, but with a sauce. And he tried his best to recreate that flavor. He approached two chemists and pharmacists, John Wheely Lee and William Henry Perrins, to try to recreate the sauce. Now, after years of trials, they actually did recreate what they thought was the sauce that he had described. But this is where things kind of become a mystery, because the assumption was that that was a fish sauce, which would make sense. They had actually already made other Asian fish sauces, and that's what they thought that this sauce was. But there's not really a big tradition in India for fermented fish sauce like there is in other parts of Asia. And so this kind of leads to the question, well, what was this sauce, and what types of ingredients were common and are still common in India that we could use to recreate this flavor? So I think what we'll do is I'm going to go over the history of this sauce, where we think it actually comes from, and the ingredients that were originally used. And as we talk about that, I'm going to make a pretty typical dish that you would use Worcestershire sauce for, which is some shepherd's pie. So the first thing I'm going to do when I'm making shepherd's pie is I mash the potatoes. So I've boiled some potatoes, mashed them up, and now I'm adding some freshly grated Parmesan cheese. Then into a nice big Dutch oven, I'm going to put some ghee, and I'm going to let that come up to temperature, and then I'm going to add a pound of ground beef and a pound of ground lamb. Now this is an important part here, because we don't want to stew the meat here. We want to keep the temp relatively high and actually cook the meat and get some browning going. That browning of our ground lamb and ground beef is called the Maillard reaction, and that browning is what gives us a deeper, more delicious flavor. And an optional part of this recipe that I like to do is sneak in some dried mushrooms at this point. My kids don't like mushrooms, but if you're careful, you can get away with it. I'm using dried morel mushrooms this time. Now that everything is mostly cooked through and we're starting to get that browning, we're going to add half a can of tomato paste. And the way I like to make shepherd's pie is I'm going to remove the meat from the Dutch oven, and we're going to add a little bit more ghee, and now we start adding our vegetables, starting with our onions, and then at this point some salt as well. When the onions begin to become translucent, I'm going to add the carrots and celery. Here's where you can add the rest of your seasoning and spices. You can add really whatever you like. I never measure anything, so I'm not going to tell you what to add or how much. It's really up to you, and everybody likes it differently. It's definitely not because I forgot to write it down while I was cooking this. I want to cook down the veggies till they're nice and soft, so we put the lid back on, and once we take the lid off, that's when I add my chicken broth. I don't use beef stock. I think it's a little too rich and dark in flavor. I like to use chicken broth instead. And when we add that broth, that's going to really deglaze the bottom of that pot and get all of those delicious little bits off the bottom. And then back goes our meat. Fresh parsley, and I always have to have peas in my shepherd's pie, so in goes a can of peas. And And then here's the star of the show. This is the main ingredient. This is the Pure Indian Foods Worcestershire sauce. And you can add as much as you like, however you like it. I will tell you that off camera, I added about twice as much as you see me putting in here. I basically doubled what you see here after I did a little taste test. And after we let that cook for a little bit and give it a stir to let those flavors all get to know each other and blend together, we're going to add our mashed potatoes on top, and we're going to get ready to stick this thing in the oven. And while it's cooking, let's rewind and go back and talk about Worcestershire sauce. You see, back in 1835, when Lee and parents were trying to come up with their original recipe, they probably did what I did, and they started trying to research what kinds of Indian fermented fish sauce are out there, and there's really not a lot. I don't think there's a big tradition, like I was saying, of fermented fish sauce in India like there is in places like Laos and China and Vietnam. So they were really just going off the description of the flavor that they got from Baron Sandy's. And they initially tried it, and it tasted horrible, so they allowed it to ferment for several years before they actually went back to taste it again. And sure enough, that really made all the difference. But they weren't really working from scratch, because fermented fish sauce has been well known since ancient times, and there was a tradition in Europe going all the way back to the Romans of this thing called garum. And this is what I think they based their fish sauce off of. And basically the main ingredient of garum would be a small dried fish that were packed in layers in between layers of salt in a giant jar or some kind of vessel. And occasionally they would be taken out, spread out in the sun to dry up even farther, and then repacked. And when it was ready, it would be taken out. The entire mixture of fish and salt would be mixed up and put into a wicker basket. And then that wicker basket would be hung inside of a large vessel, a clay jar or some kind of vase. And the drippings that seeped through the wicker basket and were collected in that jar were called liquamen. And the liquamen is the main ingredient for garum. And garum was by far the #1 most popular seasoning in ancient Rome. They used it on everything. Garum was included in so many ancient Roman recipes. It was spread throughout the entire Roman Empire. Now, I really enjoy Lee and Perrin's Worcestershire sauce. I really do like it, and I think it's very good. But our sauce is not based on garum. In fact, we are hearkening back to, believe it or not, another ancient Roman ingredient called silphium. And silphium was used in ancient Rome for all kinds of things. It was definitely used in a lot of cooking. In fact, it was so popular that there were ancient Roman coins with the plant that silphium comes from emblazoned on the coin. Now, the actual plant that silphium comes from is unfortunately extinct. In fact, we have a quote from Pliny the Elder where he says, "Within living memory, only one stock has been found, being sent to the Emperor Nero as a curiosity." So by the 1st century AD, silphium was basically extinct within the Roman Empire. So we don't really know exactly what it tasted like. In fact, silphium was only found on one tract of land in North Africa, in modern-day Libya, and it became so popular that within a few hundred years, it had been over-harvested and it was gone forever. But we do know, based on descriptions and images that are left behind, that silphium is actually part of the same family of plants as Asafoetida, or otherwise known as Hing. And since hing is a much more common ingredient in Indian cuisine, we speculate that the sauce that Baron Sandy's actually tasted in India wasn't made from dried and fermented fish. It was probably a hing-based sauce. And so that was our starting point with our recipe, and we decided to try to see if we could recreate a Worcestershire style sauce without any fish and using hing as the main flavor profile. And actually, it turned out really good. Our Worcestershire sauce really has a lot of traditional Indian ingredients in it, but the flavor is surprisingly close to a traditional Worcestershire sauce. I would say it's a little tangier and maybe even a little sweeter. Now, enough of the history lesson, let's go ahead and taste this shepherd's pie. I remember when I took it out of the oven, the smell was just amazing. And I just love making shepherd's pie. It's a great recipe that everyone in my family loves. And the nice thing about the new Pure Indian Foods Worcestershire sauce is you get a slightly different flavor because of that hing. It's not like anything else in Western cooking, but it's also not a totally new recipe. It still tastes like shepherd's pie, and I'm sure you could substitute this Worcestershire sauce in any recipe that calls for it. It's really delicious, it's really unique, and it's also a vegan option as well because there's no fish. I think this is definitely something that you need to try. I really enjoyed learning a lot about the history of Worcestershire sauce. I really enjoyed digging deep into, this mystery of trying to figure out what Baron Sandy's really tasted back in 1835, and I think this is probably the closest that you're ever going to get.